So today we're going to look at an introduction to typography. Let's get started. Our objectives for this lesson is that students will learn the basics of letter formation, learn and identify parts of a letter, or look at the anatomy of a letter, and understand that text style is an important part of visual communication and that formats are varied to convey different messages. So the first part of this lesson, we're going to look at the language of lettering. Typography is a design and use of typefaces as a means of communication. So we're specifically looking at typography and letter forms today. Typography began with the first printing press known as the Gutenberg, named after a man named Gutenberg, and is pictured in the example on the right over here. But typography really has its roots in hand lettering, which was originally created by monks and would be known as calligraphy or illuminated text and other examples of that. Lettering or typography is a very important part of visual communication. Fonts can communicate strength, power, emotion, and personality. Think of some company logos that are just a typeface: Coca-Cola, Fender, Canon, even Nike. What color are they? What does the construction of the typeface communicate about the company? What can you tell about the company from their letter forms? So with this lesson, we'll be looking at typography, letter forms, and the anatomy of letter forms and how they are broken up. And part of this is because I myself am taking a typography class and I am finding it super fun and fascinating, and I wanted to share it with you. So even if you have no interest in this whatsoever, I just wanted to share it with you because I think it's fun. So moving on. Anatomy of a letter. All right, so the following terminology is on the next couple of slides. It's a lot, but all of these things surprisingly make up letters that you look at. And this isn't even all of the terminology that comes with making letters, which kind of blew my mind when I was learning about this myself. All right, so let's get started. The baseline is the invisible bottom line on which letters sit. So for example, all of my letters on this slide come in a nice, neat rows, and that is because there is an invisible baseline holding them all together. Then you have the X height, and that is a middle line that is also invisible, that is at the top of most lowercase letters such as O or P and R, and is also at the curve of letters like an H. So imagine an invisible line at the top of all of your lowercase letters, keeping those in line. And then the last line that you have that helps you create your letter forms is called a cap height. So it's the distance from the baseline to the top of an uppercase letter like a B or an H or any other capital kind of letters. So when you're creating letters or looking at letter forms, there are 3 invisible lines that make up the supports for those letters. So you have a baseline, an X height, and a cap height. The next term we're going to look at is an ascender. An ascender is a part of a character that extends above the X height. So particularly for lowercase letters, things like the letter L in lowercase, the top half of that letter would be an ascender because it extends above the X height that the rest of the letters fit under. Then you have a descender. That is part of a character that extends below the baseline, such as the bottom strokes of a G or a P, for example. Then we have the stroke or the stem. The stem is often the main body of the letter. It's support, its spine. So if you think of letters as parts of the body, then some of this will help make sense. So the stroke or the stem is like the spine of the letter, and it is a vertical line of the letter B, or can be the primary diagonal line of the V, so primary being the first. So the first letter of the V is the stroke of that letter, okay? Then you have the crossbar or the arms, and the bars are horizontal or diagonal lines of a letter, but they can also be called arms and are open on at least one side. So these kind of mix and match a little bit. A crossbar is more for parts of like the letter B, for example. So it has a space in the center that holds the letter together, kind of a support system like the ribs. And then the arms are pieces of letters that stick out. So the top parts of the T would be considered arms, and then all the extra pieces that stick out of the letter E would be a crossbar. All right. The next page, the bowl is an open or closed circular line that creates an interior space as found in lowercase e's or b's. So the bowl can be look for any curved space that has an open area in it, and that can be known as a bowl. Then you have a counter, that is the empty space inside of the bowl. So there's two types of counters. There's the closed counter, so that's like the letter O, so the space inside the O is a closed counter. And then you have an open counter, like the letter V, and you have the space inside the V, which is called a counter, but it's open because it's not closed around all sides. Then you have the leg or the tail. So that is the bottom stroke of a letter, such as the base of an L or the diagonal stroke of a K. As you can see, they kind of like the L is like someone sitting down with their legs out, or the letter K is someone with an arm and a leg sticking out like a dancer. So legs or tails, depending on whichever you prefer. Then you have the shoulder. You kind of see the body parts coming in on this. The shoulder is the curve at the beginning of a leg of a character, such as in the lowercase m. So a shoulder is these curved parts at the top of the M that connect all these vertical lines together. Okay. Then we have the terminal. The terminal is where the letter form ends, which is usually appears as a teardrop shape. This comes with specific types of fonts, which I'll go over later. So you don't always see a terminal, but I just threw that in there because it is something you might recognize, and now you'll know the name of it. Then we also have a loop, which is similar to a bowl, but it extends under the baseline. So it's usually found in this style of letter G. So not all G's look like this, but it's any kind of font where there is a closed loop at the bottom of a letter. It's a loop. And then the last one is an ear. So these are usually only found in serif fonts, which I'll talk about later, such as with the letter G. Letter G is very popular. And that is this little tiny piece that sits next to the circular part of the G. So that is known as an ear. So it looks like an ear on the side of the head that sticks out. All right, moving on. So here is what all of these terms look like with letters. Voila. Then we have the baseline here, that nice invisible line that supports all of the letters on the bottom. We have our X height, so it measures the height of the lowercase letters. As you can see, the X height is not, in this particular style of font, is not directly in the middle of the capital height and the baseline, and that's totally okay. So whenever artists or type designers, graphic designers are creating fonts, the X height can be whatever size you want. Usually what you're looking for when you're designing a font is to have readability. So you want your readers to be able to understand the font as they read it. Sometimes they can be more decorative and they're more for art purposes than they are for reading purposes. So that of course depends on what you're designing the font for, what its function is going to be. So the X height does not have to be directly in the center. It can be up higher, it can be a little bit lower, depending on the style of font that's being created. Then we have the capital height. So cap height, that is the top line, and that is where capital letters sit. We have an example of the bar or crossbar. So that is parts of the letter that are kind of like the ribs. They connect the other parts of the letters together. We have the tail or the leg, so they stick out, like legs sticking out. We have the descender, so that's the part of the letter that goes below the baseline. Then we have the bowl, so that is almost a full loop, but not quite. So it looks like any curved part that looks like a bowl usually ends up sideways. It's a bowl. Then you have a loop, so a loop is a closed. Then we have the terminal. Terminal is any kind of little extension. This is the part I was talking about that only depends on different types of fonts, usually in serif fonts, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so terminals can be at the bottom, but they're also these teardrop kind of shapes at the top of letters, like in the R and on the A, and any kind of looped piece like that would be considered a terminal. So it's the teardroppy kind of shapes. Then we have the counter, so the space that's inside of a letter, like the O. The ascender, which is parts of the stem that extend above the X height. We have arms, so they're armatures that stick out of our stems. They look like arms. We have our ears. We have our stem, which is the vertical portion of a letter that extends between the baseline and the cap height. Then you have little pieces here called serifs. And these are only specific to serif style fonts. And again, I'll talk about the difference between a serif and a sans serif font in just a little bit. All right. So part 2, types of fonts. There are 2 types of fonts, and technically the term is not font. Technically the term is typeface, but I wanted to use font because that's a word that you are the more familiar with. So technically they're called typefaces, but for now I'm just going to call them fonts. Essentially, same difference. So fonts are divided into 2 types, which I've mentioned previously. One of those is called a serif. The other one is called sans serif. So serifs are serif fonts that are distinguishable by extra small strokes at the ends of character strokes. For example, font types like Georgia, Times New Roman, and Cambria are considered serif fonts because they have extra decorative pieces attached to the ends of their letters. Then the other type is called sans serif. So these are fonts without serifs. Sans meaning without, serif meaning serif, without serif. And these do not have extra decorative lines, so they're very straight and robotic looking. So examples of those would be Arial, Calibri, and Impact. Other things that go with fonts are lettering types. So there are 3 cases of lettering. We have upper, lower, and mixed. So a fun history fact behind lettering, in case you didn't know this. The reason we call them upper and lowercase is because of when we were using printing presses way back when with the Gutenberg, like I mentioned earlier, all of the letter forms were in these metallic structures that had the letter imprinted on them. So then they would be lined up in rows and then rolled with ink. And then basically like it's a giant stamp to make all of these documents. So they didn't have all the letters grouped by, they had them grouped by letter, but they were also grouped by their size. So the uppercase had all the larger letters, which are what we call uppercase letters. And then the bottom half of the case had lowercase letters, so the smaller ones. So hence uppercase and lowercase. Obviously mixed is not part of the case types, but that's what happens when you mix them together. You get mixed upper and lowercase letters. Okay, so there are also 4 main styles of lettering. Now these aren't the, not necessarily correct, but they're not the usual terminology used to describe these kind of letters, but I've simplified it for you to make it easier to understand. So the 4 main styles of lettering are Roman, poster, script, and unusual or trademark. So like I said, these are not the direct terminology to use for these types of lettering. There's actually a lot more types, but I'm just simplifying it this way for you since I'm throwing a bunch of new information at you. Okay. All right. So the first style of lettering that we're going to look at is Roman style. So Roman style is often a variant of thick and thin lettering and often has a thickness in different places on the stems. So they are also usually serifs and have little serif pieces on the ends of their letters. And they come from the idea of the carved stone lettering that we found in ancient Roman times. So Romans actually only carved their letters in uppercase, one, because they were much easier to use, but they used lots of straight lines and simple curves in their lettering because that was the easiest to carve. And they could also make it indented in a way that they won't deteriorate from the weather. So it was actually very clever. So Romans essentially created the first uppercase lettering style, which is kind of cool. So fonts that you may have seen over your years that are Roman style are Elephant, Cooper, or Cooper Black, I think, Bernard, Bodoni, Broadway, Gaudi, and Wide Latin. Obviously, these aren't the only ones, but these are some usual ones that you might see in your font selections of your documents. Okay. The next style of lettering is poster style, and these can be bold or general, and they're very popular and easy to read. They have an even thickness overall. They can have serifs, but they also usually don't. So that just depends on the style of the lettering itself. So for example, the Tide logo would be a poster style because it's very bold and thick lettering. Then you have Aharoni, Berlin Sans, Arial Black, Eris Bold, and Impact are types of poster styles. So very thick, bold lettering that's naturally bold. They don't have a thinner style of lettering. So these are poster styles. The third style of lettering is called script, and it's a connected style of lettering that can be either thick or thin or have a varying degree of thick or thinness. They're usually in an italic slanted writing. They're very graceful and decorative, so they look a lot like handwriting or cursive. Most script fonts are called script in the title, so that makes it really easy to find out. And they're usually very fancy looking and used for fancy documents. So things like brush script or Edwardian script, French script, Harlow, Lucida handwriting, or Lucida calligraphy. Some of those are ones that I like to use myself. Minstrel or Mistral and Vladimir script are some examples of script styles that you may have seen. The last style of lettering that we're going to look at is unusual or trademark. So these are text styles that are unique and creative. They can be specific to a logo design for a company and are usually copyright protected, or they can be an unusual style that the font style matches the name that they gave it. So for example, Chiller or Jokerman fonts, which you've probably seen or even used, are considered unusual fonts because they're very specific to the name that they were given and kind of resemble that. So the Jokerman has all these fun little extra pieces to them. The letters are thick and thin in different places and have extra shapes added on. And then Chiller is very kind of creepy looking with its thick and thin drips, very horror-esque. So those are unusual because they're very specific and would have specific uses. You wouldn't really use Chiller or Jokerman to write a paper because that would get really hard to read. Then we have trademarks. The actual term for this is logotype, and that is because the logo for the company is created with type. So Coca-Cola, Fender, Canon, I said Nike earlier, even though they have their little swoosh, but Nike is what's printed on their shoes and their apparel when they're not using the swoosh. So these are logo types. They're text designed specifically for the company to represent the company. So that's something to think about if you're looking into doing graphic design in your life. Typography is a big part of that.